Being heard and listening is so important, and to listen and to hear with empathy is even better.
In my description, I would say try to put in the shoes of the other person. Try to detach from yourself, maybe from your experience, your current situation, and try to put yourself mentally into the mind of the other person. I think the top one that helped me to achieve everything in life was to try to think that I'm not right and the other person is not right, or vice versa. There is no right and wrong. So when we communicate with the other person, that is their perspective and this is my perspective. When we have this kind of mindset that nothing is right and nothing is wrong, it's just based on our perspective, our past experiences, what we want to achieve, as I said, in the future as aspiration, and what I'm experiencing now is where I notice and experience a lot of empathy and a lot of collaboration with the other person.
Welcome to Mindset, Mood and Movement, a systemic approach to human behavior, performance and well-being. Being heard and listening is so important, and to listen and to hear with empathy is even better. Now, I'm delighted today to be joined by Alessandro, who's going to be talking with me around all things empathy and communication. Now, he is a specialist in the field of marketing psychology, so he's got a really nice lens about working with business and marketing from a psychological perspective. And I'm going to come out from my perspective, so hopefully this conversation is going to get really into the nuances of how we can use empathy, like what processes, what's going to be important, what can we learn to help you listen better and be heard better. So that's what we're getting into. Alessandro, it's great to have you on the podcast. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Sal. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's beautiful. Let's tuck in. I'm a big fan of words and getting really clear on things. So when we talk about empathy, let's describe that. Shall we be really clear? Because one person's empathy might be another person's sympathy. So let's describe it. What is empathy in your description, please?
In my description, I would say try to put in the shoes of the other person. Try to detach from yourself, maybe from your experience, your current situation, and try to put yourself mentally into the mind of the other person. This is my simplest way. It's not to say, I understand you, but it's more living, maybe experiencing their emotion, their current emotion.
Beautiful. Really nicely put. Yeah, being in the shoes of another, being in that person's experience, probably at that time as well, because if someone's in a highly emotional state or relaxed state, then how they are is going to be state dependent as well. I think empathy is really interesting. We, as humans, have mirror neurons in our brains. So there's brain cells which essentially mirror other people. And it makes us very, very compassionate and empathetic towards others. It's what keeps us bonded. Some of us seem to have a high range for empathy, and some of us have a lower range. So there are fluctuations, but I find empathy is one of these really important qualities that actually I think we can get better at. In my experience, we can kind of train our empathetic understanding and learning. But we're with people, yeah. We care and we want to be cared, and we listen and we want to be heard. And I think it's so important. So perhaps you give us a little bit of insight where your journey into the work with marketing and psychology, and particularly empathy. How did you get drawn to this?
Yes, the majority of people, I think, are aware of the meaning of marketing, but less people maybe with the consumer psychology side. So the way that I define like marketing, there are at least two people. One person that sends a message, the sender, and the other one which is the recipient, the person that receives a message. But in the past, I saw a lot of people maybe using a very simple language, but was not enough like with emotional words, keywords that empathize with the other person, so put in the shoes of the other person. Or they might use a more standard message, a message that if I use it with yourself or with another person was exactly the same. Most people were ignoring who the other person is, who is the recipient. So I always, even when I grow up, ask question why, the why of everything. I will ask you why people use the same kind of language if they speak with maybe a founder, if they speak with a friend, or maybe with a colleague. So back in 2018, I decided to focus more on the psychological side. So I study consumer psychology and marketing. where it was 30% around the marketing, so the communication between at least two people. But all the rest was about the psychology, why people behave in a certain way, why people communicate in a certain way. However, despite like that the consumer psychology was part of my background, I wanted to understand how can I empathize with a person? How can I experience the same feeling, the same emotion of the other person, which is a much deeper level than marketing and compared to even like consumer psychology. So I started like understanding how can I use maybe some words that are more emotional, more related to the other person rather than treating everyone in the same way. So I dived into like the empathetic way. How can I create and make it be an emotion when I speak with another person by tailoring me or my customizing my language to the other person.
Really nice, very eloquent and super interesting. You know, the field of psychology is a wonderful field, but it is a piece of the human experience and it's a piece of human communication, which if we don't bring in the emotional strata and the emotional qualities, then we really miss it. You know, we are cognitive, we're emotional, and we're physiological beings, aren't we? And it's really interesting because there's a lot of amazing, clever things such as nudging and, psychological ways to frame things in marketing and in business. And yet, if we take empathy and leave that to one side, it can be cold, it feels to me. Whereas if we bring empathy in, there's not only connection, but there's respect for the other person, respect for that, their needs and their wants. And I think there's a real dignity in that. And I really, when we started to speak, I was like, yeah, it's just such an interesting point of conversation. So thank you. Very interesting. When you were going through your journey of that consumer psychology and empathy, how do you see empathy as in fitting around perhaps the language patterns you might use? So Alessandro, what are you seeing about how to use empathy and how that affects your language and perhaps the language patterns between you and another or me and another? Can you give some examples of how the empathy will actually change the language and the patterns that we might be using?
Yes, sure. Let me think, or let me give you like maybe a practical example. Let's say you are a coach and you help founders to become more productive by looking at, for example, by saying our mind, maybe our emotion, our body is function like a unique ecosystem. And I know that, for example, you are stressed, you feel stress, burnout, and I might like suggest you a breathing exercise that is very helpful for like the problem that you are experiencing. So this message, if we take just this message, can resonate or cannot resonate with the other person, with maybe a client or potential client. So as maybe the sender, like the coach, we might think about that all the actions that we take are based on emotional drivers. So what is going on in our mind could be based on maybe past experiences, the present actions, what we are experiencing now, or future aspiration, future actions that influence our decision. So in that case, if I'm like the sender, the person, or the coach that I'm sending a message, I want to empathize with the other person by thinking about probably this person at this stage had the negative experiences about breathing exercise in the past, and they might think that the breathing exercise cannot help. They reduce the level of stress or anxiety. So they might ignore not because of the exercise itself, but because of lack of time. So they didn't dedicate enough time to recognize the signal of the stress, the signal of the burnout. So now when you are explaining the breathing exercise, they might think that maybe doing breathing exercise might not work for me because of past experiences. So as a sender, I need to be aware that past experiences influence my present thought, what I'm now thinking about your suggestion. But at the same time, if we want to empathize with the other person, we want to also think about bringing them into a journey, like what are the future aspirations. So in that case, you can use a certain language and we can maybe look at some strategies about what is the language that we can use in order to tell the person, listen what I'm recommending you. And if you listen and you come with me into this journey, this is what you can achieve. You can maybe prevent burnout by making time for yourself. So just to maybe reiterate, I want to empathize with the other person. I need to think about past actions, present action and thought, and future action that this person is experiencing when I'm talking to them.
Yeah, really, really nice. And it makes you think about a lot of the work I do in the psychological element of my coaching, where we look at someone's timeline. We look at where they've come from, where they are, and where they're going. And sometimes we can have a real past bias. We're really biased by what's happened in events from the past. And, we say things such as, I'm not good at this, or whatever the I am statement. And it's based on a past experience and probably layers of them. The problem with that is it keeps thinking in the past. And as you've alluded to, they're anchored in that past experience. So if you can't talk to that in a healthy way, you can't bring them to present and future, which is so, so important. And curiously, one thing I want to ask you, so I do this as a coach, but I want to know how you do it as you're in your own profession. How do you empathize? Because of course we don't want to get muddled up with assumptions, like assuming that person had a good or bad experience, or assuming they want this or that. So in my work is asking elegant questions, being really interested. How do you go about finding the right information so you can use empathy and then use the right language to work with them?
I do exactly the same where I ask questions. So I try, if there is a conversation with a prospect, a potential client, I ask, I spend like maybe 80% of the time asking questions, constructive questions, and 20% I present the solution. But presenting the solution is going to be the last part of the conversation. And
I love it. I'm laughing because, we're talking about listening and conversation. It's like, yes, this is it, isn't it? When you ask really great questions and you get in there, you're like, oh, that's amazing. Or, oh, that's interesting. So I'm so pleased to hear you said that.
That is a way that I think the other person start like sharing everything. And in the back of my mind, what I just presented is, okay, and now I'm thinking the past, the present, and the future. So when I ask questions about their past experiences. Maybe I'm working as a consultant, marketing consultant. Have you ever worked with maybe a marketing consultant for your business? If they say yes, then I'm going to ask a follow-up question about their past experience. Then based on the past experience, I move to the present. How do you feel now maybe investing time into your marketing strategy? And then what is your aspiration? Where you see yourself maybe in 12 months' time working together. So all the questions start from the past, they move to the present and the future. When I got enough information about the problems of the other person, and now the key point is, can I help this person? Because if I cannot help the person after a very constructive conversation, I can suggest introduce you to someone else, or I can say, I cannot help you. So I want to empathize with you to say, I really understand your problem, but I'm not the right expert for you. So there are some strategies that if you want, I can share with you, with everyone, that allowed you to have the other person open and listen to you, despite you might give the solution or say, there is someone else who is better than me in terms of solving this particular problem.
Yeah, I think it'd be really good to hear that. And just before we come to that, it's such an interesting point of reference. If you're not a coach or consultant, work with psychology, it can be quite a new concept that we have this timeline and we are influenced extensively by what's happened, what's happening, and what we would like to happen. And I think one of the interesting things I see, certainly from people who are getting stuck with issues, whether it's communication problems or in the coaching space, they're not moving forward with what they want, is because they haven't been able to connect with the future enough. So there's a connection to the present problem. And if you're in a problem state, you're normally trying to solve the problem. And it's normally an away from pattern. Like, I'm trying to get away from the problem. Whereas if we've got, well, okay, I'm going to solve my problem. So for me, it's normally, how do I live my life in a certain way and run my business in a certain way so I have all the outputs I want? For you, it might be a marketing project, but the details are different, but the want is the same. But one of the big things I find, Alessandro, is that I've got to get someone into the future space, because Otherwise, we sort of cycle through past, present, and it keeps, in many ways, recycling the past. And empathizing with that, for me, one thing I have to do is try and empathize with their future self that they haven't met yet, which is very interesting. But so there's my, but you mentioned about some examples, and I think they'd be really helpful. Because if someone's listening thinking, it's all very, very cool, how might I deploy that in a conversation, whether it's, in a friend or a professional conversation? So give us a couple of examples that would be very helpful to use.
Yeah, so probably the example works better for maybe a written communication, but also a verbal one if you have these 3 key points in mind you can keep when you have a conversation with a prospect or an existing client. So I usually what I call like acknowledge the other person's situation. So if we look at like the previous example, we want to say, I understand that you are feeling, for example, overwhelmed and stressed out. So we acknowledge the situation of the other person. So Alessandro is understanding that I'm feeling not right at the moment. And then you can say, it's completely normal. So in that case, you open the door from the other person because you say, you are not the only one. Many people are experiencing this, what you are experiencing now. So you are not the only one. So the other person doesn't feel like maybe an outsider. They feel part of a community of people that are stressed. They might not share with friends or maybe with an expert like you, but they feel that kind of stress. So when we acknowledge the other person's situation, the other person feels more relaxed and to listen what we're going to say later. Then what is the strategy? Now we need to share our own experience, our own point of view. So you can say, have been there myself. So the other person think, okay, they can understand me. They know that it's normal and they were already like lived they've already experienced what I'm experiencing now. And then you can say, what really helped me, and you share what helped you. So you say, I'm already been there. I can guide you and I can share with you what was really helpful. And you can give the example of the breathing exercise. But then we need to move from the empathetic way of communicating to a more business one, where we're going to suggest find common ground based on each person's perspective. You might think that the breathing exercise is helpful or not. So in this case, we can propose like, perhaps we can try this exercise, but then the key point, so the cherry on the cake is, what do you think? You ask, what do you think to the other person? So the person feel like listened. So you use the emotion, but you also go, we need to take action now, because otherwise the future is going to be the same as today or maybe yesterday. So it's more about acknowledging the other person's situation first. Then you share your own personal experience as a consultant or coach. And then you suggest a common ground and you ask the question, what do you think?
Yeah. That's such a nice, simple yet powerful 3-step process. That's lovely. Thank you. It's something which I do generally with my work, but making it explicit is a really nice way to do. And I think the distinction I want to say here that I know works, and when I've done it well, it's worked, and when I've missed it by accident, it hasn't worked, is the sharing versus telling. Because as you rightly say, many of us have had experiences, whether it's a life experience or a business experience, and we're like, yeah, wow, I hear what you're saying, I acknowledge that, and hey, I had that challenge of, going through a difficult part and growing my business. But if you go into telling mode, such as, here's what you need to do, we become a mentor, officially, or a teacher. And if we haven't been asked for that, that becomes, unsolicited advice. It's not seen as an empowering way of communication in most respects. There is a time for a bit of good advice, but what you said there is very important. Share your experience. This is what happened to me. This is what I did. I worked with a consultant, or I hired a team to do X. And then you share that. And then, of course, that opens up conversation about shared experience as opposed to telling people what to do, which is a directed experience. So that's really, really nice.
There is a point that we want to have freedom of listening and taking decision. So when I share with you an experience, it's more helping you to take the decision. I'm just suggesting you a way of experiencing the thing that I'm experiencing now after having solved my problem. I'm not telling you, it's not that I read a book about how to solve like stress. I've already experienced, I've already try to find ways, and this is the best solution. So I'm suggesting you that something that I use for myself rather than just telling you what I read on a book, which is a big difference to build trust.
It is, and it's curious, isn't it, where the subtlety in a conversation between two people, you might think you're acknowledging and you might think you're helping, so the sentiment behind it can be there, but the execution, if we end up telling someone you should do this and that's what's going to work, as opposed to sharing what worked for us and then inviting them in and say, hey, and what do you think and what would you like to do? Subtle, but it changes everything. And this is empathy, right? It's two people feeling and connecting, but maybe moving towards that. I think it's compassion really is the next phrase where, you're building something with action. But if you don't get out of position, what my old master used to talk about position. So position 1 is us, the I, Sal, Alessandro. Position 2 is the other. So for now, it's Sal is the one, Alessandro is the other, the second. And it's really important to second position, go into that person. And if you've got some real ability, I go to third position and try and see what's happening between us. What's happening in our relationship and being empathetic in that quest. Now, of course, it's another step, but it's very, very important. Now, I wanted to ask you, what's one of the biggest challenges where empathy hasn't worked or it's caused something when you've been playing around with this or using it in professional context? When has it caused any kind of problems or things you weren't expecting?
Empathy, I think you can learn to be more empathetic with a person, but not everyone is empathetic in the same way. Some people, they say that the women are more empathetic than men. Could be true, but we can learn how to become more empathetic. And this is based on my very personal experience. The only thing that when we communicate, we need to really understand what is the communication style of the other person. Because there are some people that they are more dominant. Some people, they might be more influential. Others, they are more steady with their communication style, and others, they are more conscientious. So the communication style is the most important thing. So at the beginning, we look at the past, the present, and the future actions. Then we look, okay, now how can I communicate with a person? So we said that I acknowledge your situation, then I share an experience, and then I suggest you a solution. But this suggesting the solution is the key point to understand. How can I emulate, how can I mirror the communication style of the other person? So in marketing, we use a model which is called DISC, D-I-S-C, communication style, that based on the communication style of the other person, whether is a very dominant person, we want to use some word that take control of your stress. So the word control make the other person feel close to what you are saying, because it's maybe a word that they use very often when they communicate. If the same person is more an influential one, you can say feel uplifted and energized with maybe as you harmonize your mind, emotion, and body. So it's the same problem, but a different way of communicating. If it's more a steadiness, like in the communication style, you can say maintain your inner peace and balance by regularly practicing this breathing exercise. So the inner peace work is going to help the other person to feel close to you. And if it's instead a more conscientious communication style, you can use it. This is a perfect synchronization between the body and the mind. So the biggest problem is not be empathetic enough, is to really understand how can I be empathetic even with the communication style, not just with the emotion that the other person is experiencing, but how can I emulate, how can I mirror the communication style of the other person?
That's so interesting. I'm going to get you to expand a bit more on DISC in a second, but I remember I did my psychotherapy training. One of the big things that we got taught by a very great trainer, she's people represent things in their own mind in a particular way. So if someone is a visual representative, so they see things in images, And they might use visual language like, oh, I see what you mean, and I'm getting a picture of what's going on. If you talk in, let's say, auditory language, so, oh yeah, that's right, that resonates with me, and yeah, that sounds good. There's a mismatch in the language, which is, I think, similar to what you're saying with the disc profiling. But we can only hear the other's language if we're quiet enough within to listen and to hear. And I think that was one of my biggest lessons, because I wasn't, when I first started this work, I couldn't hear. That's what I sort of think. I have amazing trainers like, no, go quiet, calm, listen to it, really listen. Don't just listen, but deeply listen. And then you're like, oh, I am hearing the language words or the references or the subtleties. And I think that was the difference to learn the skill, was to be quiet enough in my own mind. Because, in conversation, there can be a lot going on and we forget. We can get into reactionary mode. But that's my experience. But can we go into the DISC thing a little bit deeper? So DISC, as you've already expanded upon. So if I am in communication with a client, let's say, and I'm listening out for the DISC profile, and just give me the DIS and C again in the single words. So it's
dominance, which is the D, the influence, which is the I, the S is the stateness, and the C is the conscientiousness.
Perfect. Yeah. So there's a different quality to all of those already. So how would we tune into that? So give us an example of perhaps a conversation between, like a consultant, like myself, and a client. So what are we listening for? We've already, because I've kind of pulled out that, be quiet enough to hear. So if we're in conversation and we're going to overlay the DISC principle and DISC model, give us a few examples of what you've already kind of given. Give us an example of how that might play out in a conversation, maybe even between us now. Let's see if we can give that an example.
I think the most important thing, first of all, you need to really understand that written communication is much easier than a verbal communication. Because in a written, you can go on a website, or you can take an email, or you can go on LinkedIn in profile and see the language that they use, see what word they use. So when you reply to an email, you can replicate what word they use and really understand whether maybe they are very direct, assertive with their communication, or result oriented. That is a more dominant one. If they are more maybe like a sociable, enthusiastic, persuasive, is more an influential one. But why, when we have maybe a verbal communication, my best advice is to look before like the meeting with a prospective client, their website, everything that they use, like the written communication, like maybe an email, a website, a LinkedIn profile, and try to analyze what are the words, what they want to achieve in the future. They are very, very clear to the point, or they are more influential. So really, really understanding, preparing yourself before a video call or before like a meeting in person is essential, because we can like train ourselves to have conversation with people and try to think after the conversation. Was more a dominant person, more an influential? So what kind of person is? But it requires a lot of training, because when now we are like discussing maybe more, you are more maybe dominant and influential from my point of view, because you are very, very clear to the point. You might say, can you maybe reiterate the 3 main points? So this is a more dominant one. But you are very enthusiastic, very persuasive. So that is a more influential one. So the key is to not think that like the dominance, the influence, the stateness, and the conscientiousness as 4 individual communication styles. They can work in tandem. Most of the time we see like the dominant and the influential together, and the stateness and the conscientiousness together. So the strategy is to really understand whether the other person is very patient, very reliable, cooperative when they communicate with us, to try to find, for example, common ground for the breathing exercise. Okay, this person requires more time to really process what I'm saying. If it's a more analytical, how long does it take to maybe resolve my problem? Okay, they are more conscientiousness. So we need to really understand whether they are goal-oriented, maybe they are more like persuasive with their language. If they are more like patient and cooperative, that they want to find a solution together, they're more steadiness. Instead, if they are very detail-oriented, systematic, they are more like conscientious. So based on that, you should like replicate into your conversation, verbal conversation. But the key is to prepare yourself.
Yeah, that's just such gold. Because of course, when we're in conversation, particularly if it's around, let's say, a business topic, then we're going to be in flow with that business topic. So for me, it's coaching, for you, it's your marketing. And we're really working with that space. So trying to do the other thing as well, it might be too much of an ask and then you get distracted. So I think that's an excellent piece of advice. Look at someone's content, understand that and get a feel for it. Now, I coached a client a while back and he would have the conscientious approach. He was a very deliberate, detailed thinker, quite slow. And one of his colleagues was a very dominant character, bang, 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 like do this, do that. They had such a difficult conversation. And we covered it to a large extent. But when I heard the two types of conversation, there was completely, it's like, oh, yes, you're Italian, right? And I'm English. And if you only spoke Italian, I only speak English, we're not going to be able to communicate much because we need to have, thankfully you can speak my language. I do apologize. My Italian's no good. But, we do need to speak others' languages. And I think what was interesting, Alessandro, was this particular guy, he didn't want to be a direct person because it wasn't who he was. It would be disingenuous. And the other person wasn't in the coaching space, so they weren't even up for change. They just carried on as they were. So we found a middle ground with them, which was to come up to some degree to that, be okay with the dominant communication, but only go as far as you want to. And it seemed to work for him. He bought his time when he needed to. He thought deeper when he needed to, but then he had more edge when he needed to. So it's a really interesting point. Do you find that certain conditions like emotional states or situations change our communication style?
You read my mind. I would say exactly the same. Because some people, they say, I'm very dominant. You're very dominant when you have a very positive emotions. But life is not inside of a vacuum. Sometimes we feel maybe sad for any kind of reason. So we become more maybe the steadiness one. So our current emotions also influence the way we communicate. The communication style is not influenced by just our way of communicating, but also our emotions, our current emotions, and our future aspirations. If my aspiration is to become the best of something, I use a dominant, more an influential. If instead I'm not really sure about my future, I want to be more conscientiousness because I'm more let's say, precise, structured, because there is a level of uncertainty. So I want to use a communication style that doesn't expose myself to make mistakes. But I might be, the rest of the year, a very dominant one. So emotional are the most important emotional drivers in our communication style.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. And it's something I've seen. I remember coaching someone a while back and they did the psychometric test. I can't remember the main one, Myers-Briggs. They did a Myers-Briggs test and they told me they were a certain profile. And I was very interested. I thought, okay, it is an interesting process. And one of the things they said, they were an introvert. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm an introvert. So they've already identified with it, which is an interesting statement for a coach to hear because when you identify, you get very attached to it. But what I noticed, they told me an example where they were an extrovert. They were performing in one particular way. I won't share too much details because it's confidential, but they were performing. I was like, so that's quite an extroverted action. And you were very good at it and you enjoyed it. And it's explaining to them that we're not stuck in one way of being. So personality is more fluid based on the environmental factors. And those also are emotional factors. So I think it's something I wanted to name and ask you, and I'm glad we covered it because our emotional state, I would say, really wants tending to before we do our psychological state. I mean, they're all one part of the system and you can't take them apart, but sometimes we need to put a lens of attention on it. Because if you want to communicate well, what are you communicating from? How are you? Are you steady? Are you stressed? Are you worried or are you confident? And if you get the internal communications, like have a conversation with internally, right, okay, I'm there. And then you'll probably have a communication style which is true for you, but it does feel that we need to tend to that. In my experience of people who have communication issues, they get into a stress state. There's a sense of threat to some degree. And then they respond to the threat with either too much edge, too much directness, or they're too timid and they back away from it, rather than a more coherent way of communicating and solving the problem. So cool. Very, very cool. Would you give us one, I'm really interested in kind of sort of putting this to one whole thing. So when we think about communication and empathy and really learning about these styles, what's some of your most important experiences that you know are the right thing to bring to the day-to-day, not just every night, but day-to-day, how to show up and to do well in the world with great communication? What are some of your practices that you would bring?
I think to be honest with your current emotions is the most important thing, because it can be a dominant, and the majority of the times people that they look that they are the dominant because they are stressed inside. So they use the communication style as a way of defending their weakness inside. So be honest, I don't feel really good today, so I like to maybe spend the next 20 minutes by doing X, Y, and Z. So that is more like a conscientiousness, because I want to go straight to the point. But if I feel very inspired, because sometimes my experience when it's sunny day, I feel more inspired. So I use a more like persuasive language, but be like honest with the other person, even as like a prospect to a client. Let's share our experiences. Maybe the other person empathize what I'm saying is more like a way of being genuine with your emotions, and the other person trusts you because you are not hiding any emotion. You are sharing with an emotion. Obviously, there needs to be not like 90% of sharing emotion with the other person. But if you maybe share 10%, you say, oh, I did this today, I feel very inspired. Or when you ask, how are you today? Oh, today is a sunny day, I feel very, very inspired. Just that small like sharing of the emotion help the other person to feel relaxed, because the sender of the message is sharing how they feel. Probably I also can share my emotion as a recipient, and you start creating this kind of empathy, because you don't start with the selling, but you are starting with, let's share together our emotion. And then we can talk about everything else. But sharing emotion, be open, is where you create this level of trust and empathy. So it's the starting point for me.
I love it. That's just such brilliant guidance, isn't it? And it's so easy to forget, where if we just say, yeah, I was on a coaching call before this, and actually, yeah, it was like, how are you today? And it was a genuine question, not the how are you flippant question. It was a genuine, how are you and what's been going on? And there's a certain state and certain mood that I come to the session, the client comes to the session, and in fact, you've just made that really clear in my mind about even being more explicit, like, yeah, I'm actually really inspired today, or I'm really deep thoughtful today, or whatever that is. Because actually there's something around the authenticity, isn't there, about, hey, this is what's really happening. I'm not trying to be anything. I am being something. And that means there's less effort. Because I find it's really interesting when we think about language patterns and communication. If there's too much trying, it can feel a bit fake. If you feel like, well, what's going on? Where yes, you can be conscientious and careful with what you're saying and the right approach. But if it's easy, effortless, relaxed, authentic, then that's on a deep level of connection. There's people will get trust from that as well, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Really, really cool. As a final thought for our listeners who will be, I hope, jotting down notes and replaying and listening to all the steps you got given us, because there's some brilliant ones here. What are any last key thoughts that you would like to add to, what our key thing today is about empathy and communication, and just how vital it is, not just for good outcomes, but for human connection? What other points would you like to summarize on?
I think the top one that helped me to achieve everything in life was to try to think that I'm not right and the other person is not right, or vice versa. There is no right and wrong. So when we communicate with the other person, that is their perspective, and this is my perspective. When we have this kind of mindset that nothing is right and nothing is wrong. It's just based on our perspective, our past experiences, what we want to achieve, as I said, in the future as aspiration. And what I'm experiencing now is where I notice and experience a lot of empathy and a lot of collaboration with the other person. Because I don't think that everyone think like me, and I don't expect anyone thinking like me. When I have this openness, very open mind to say, let's see what other people think. And the majority of the time I try to communicate with people that think the opposite compared to me. So I want to learn more. So when I'm in front of another person that think like maybe Bob, I know the way that they think. So I can create empathy because I've already trained myself to put in the shoes of a person that had a very different perspective. So just to reiterate, is to be open, to listen and not judgmental. The other person can be right or wrong, but that is just a personal experience. Let's take everything and try to see why that person thinking that way. Can I maybe borrow something from that experience of the other person and use for mine? That is where I see like a lot of happiness. When people say, why you smile? I smile because I see the point. I see why you are telling this thing. Because despite I'm not thinking, I wouldn't do like this, but I really understand why you are saying that. Let me think about next time if I'm going to do this particular thing and try to do what you are doing. So it's more be open to listen, as we said, like listen and be very empathetic. Put in the shoes of the other person without judgment, or without judging the other.
Wise words. And it's such a powerful message. And I think when I work with a lot of people, and I think my own working practice, there's always a lot to do. If you run a business, there's always a lot of things to do. And I think when time is squeezed, we don't have the space for this consideration, this setting up and considerate approach. So if it's, and I coach people like, do not have back-to-back meetings. This is just not good for every level. But if there's no space to consider and go, yeah, who am I meeting? I mean, Alessandro. Okay, let's just be with Alessandro for a minute in my mind. What's he like? And because if there's no space for that, it's going to be very hard to be intentional about communication and intentional about empathy, because it is likely to be reactionary about, well, who am I and who is this? So beautiful. And I love what you said there about I'm not right and you're not right. There just is. I think that's my interpretation. But it's like, oh, that's your truth. That's my truth. That's interesting. And I think that opens up a really nice space as opposed to my world versus your world, or my opinion versus yours, and which is an argument really. One wins, one loses, where connection and communication is about all. Yeah, it's wholeness, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
That's amazing. I've really enjoyed listening and learning a bit more today. Some things I know and some things I'm like, yeah, I've forgotten that and I need to do more of that. So I'm really appreciative for you coming to join us on our MMM podcast today. Alessandro, thank you. If listeners would like to get hold of you, we shall put some details in the show notes. But in terms of your work, so you mentioned that you are consumer psychology and marketing. Could you just give us a final summary of, if someone's working with you, what do you help them with?
The first thing is like having clarity in their mind, because a product or service that we offer to other people is like a projection of our inner state. If they have clarity in their mind, who is the client that I can help with? What are their problems? What are maybe their fears? The level of impact of acting or not acting, so working with me or not working with me. How can I communicate with this person in a more empathetic way? So the biggest problem that I've noticed now is clarity. Who is my client? Because most people try to help everyone, but then the message is diluted. While when we really identify who is the person, how can I communicate with this person in a more empathetic way? Because as you said, like I'm marketing expert, but with the consumer psychology, in particular the empathy-driven strategies. I help like professionals, maybe consultant, coaches, and now even like accountant and solicitors or small businesses, tech companies, to become more empathetic with their communication, so they start competing on results and value rather than just on price, because they use the empathy strategy.
Yeah, beautiful. Really nicely put. So it's really great. So if someone's listening, then that is Alessandro and what he can do. Fantastic. We need more empathy in the world. Cool. Well, thank you once again for joining us, dear listener. As always, do what I do, which is a replay or use an AI app. Don't care. Capture this gold. If you had to pay Alessandro, you'd be paying a fortune. You've just had a whole almost an hour with his beautiful exploration around emotions, empathy, and communication. And there's loads of great stuff in there which we can all apply. So thank you, Alessandro. It's been great to have you. Dear listener, thank you again. And then I'll see you on the next one. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe. And if a friend would benefit from hearing this, do send it on to them as well. If you would like to get in touch yourself, then you can go to my website, which is saljeffreys.com, spelled SALJEFFERIES, saljeffreys.com. Hit the Get in Touch link, and there you can send me a direct message. If you'd like to go one step further and learn whether coaching can help you overcome a challenge or a block in your life, then do reach out and I offer a call where we can discuss how this may be able to help you. Until the next time, take care.